Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really digging into a huge idea in American history, something often called the frontier myth.
That's right. It's pretty foundational.
We've pulled together insights mainly from one key source, Greg Grandin's book, The End of the Myth. It covers a lot of ground, from the frontier idea right up to the border wall.
Yeah, it's a really comprehensive look.
So our mission here is to kind of unpack this, pull out the key insights, and help you understand what this myth actually was, how it worked, and what its consequences have been right up to now.
And we'll be getting pretty detailed, looking closely at what the sources tell us.
Okay, let's dive in. Where do we start with this core concept, this belief in the regenerative power of the frontier? What did that actually mean for people?
Well, initially, it was tied to a real thing, For a lot of people, heading west genuinely felt like a chance to escape tough circumstances, maybe even get rich.
A fresh start?
A fresh start, exactly. And from that experience grew this belief that the frontier itself, this huge expanse of land, was the reason for America's power and wealth. It became an explanation.
Like a diagnosis for why the U.S. was succeeding.
Precisely. But it didn't stay just a diagnosis, did it?
No, the source says it also became a prescription. How so?
Well, policymakers started looking at it as a kind of model, a guide for how to keep extending U.S. power and wealth. If expansion worked geographically, maybe that principle could be applied elsewhere.
Which is fascinating because even when the actual land, the physical frontier, was basically gone.
Yeah, declared closed in 1890.
Right. Even then, the idea just kept going. It migrated.
It really did. The imagery, the language of the frontier, it got applied to, well, almost everything. Markets, war, culture, technology, science.
Even the psyche, politics.
You name it. It turned into this incredibly flexible, powerful national metaphor.
Okay, and the sources really emphasize a big shift after World War II. The frontier wasn't just about land anymore. It became central to this vision of a new kind of world order. How is that different?
Well, think about old empires. They were often about grabbing finite resources, taking wealth from rivals.
A zero-sum game.
Exactly. But the U.S., after the war, with its unprecedented economic power, basically claimed it could preside over a global economy based on endless growth.
So applying the frontier logic globally, the idea being that wealth wasn't finite, it could just keep expanding.
Yes, that was the core promise. A limitless global frontier meant wealth wasn't zero-sum. It could theoretically be shared by all.
Interesting.
And it's really telling that the post-war planners, according to the source, actually reached back to Jacksonian language. They talked about extending the world's area of freedom, enlarging the circle of free institutions.
Wow, so directly connecting that old expansionist idea with the new global order.
It shows how deep that connection ran. Freedom equals expansion.
But of course, this whole ideal wasn't without its critics. The sources bring up Martin Luther King Jr., and his analysis sounds pretty devastating.
It really was. He argued this ideal fueled multiple interconnected problems, reinforcing pathologies, the source calls them.
Like racism?
Racism, yeah, but also a kind of violent masculinity and a moralism that, ended up celebrating the rich while blaming the poor for their situation.
And he saw a direct link between foreign wars and domestic problems, right? The quote about Vietnam.
The flamethrowers in Vietnam fanned the flames in our cities, and the bombs in Vietnam exploded home. Powerful stuff.
What was his core point there?
That this constant need to expand, to flee forward, whether west or overseas, was a way for the U.S. to avoid dealing with its own internal issues. Deep problems like inequality, racism, violence.
It was easier to look outward.
Much easier, he argued, than doing the hard work of reckoning at home.
And other critics chimed in too.
Yeah, some argued imperialism helped buy off parts of the white working class, or that it just smoothed over political conflicts by creating external opportunities. Some even brought in Freudian ideas, projecting violent fantasies outward.
Which leads us to this really potent metaphor the source discusses, the safety valve.
Right. Emerges with steam engines, but then gets applied rhetorically to westward expansion.
And its utility seems clear, especially in Jacksonian America. That era, the source calls it a crying contradiction.
Unparalleled freedom and unmatched unfreedom, side by side.
Liberty and slavery. How did the safety valve metaphor help manage that?
Well, it offered a way to release pressure, theoretically. Abolitionists like Eliza Wright used it first, but critically. They saw colonization schemes sending freed slaves away as a safety valve for an oppressive system. But they didn't want to just vent it.
They wanted to break the machine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But slaveholders grabbed the metaphor too.
How did they use it?
They pointed their safety valve towards new territories: Arkansas, Alabama, Texas. Sending freed slaves out would remove social conflict, they argued, and sending white settlers would add slave states, boosting Southern political power.
Senator McDuffie explicitly called Texas a safety valve to let off the superabundant slave population.
It's incredibly blunt. And then there's that quote from the Virginia planter in 1840. It's just chilling.
Saying God provided a safety valve in the Deep South, which bought slaves and worked them to death in 7 years.
Yeah. It just exposes the horror the metaphor could cover up.
Now, the sources also say that even if free land didn't always work perfectly as a safety valve for poor white workers because of speculators' costs, railroads,
Right, it wasn't always accessible.
it still worked effectively as a threat, a
Right.
standing threat.
Yeah, the idea that workers could theoretically go west helped keep wages down and reduce pressure for redistribution back east. It served the interests of capital.
And this connects to another complicated point. The blurring of anti-slavery and anti-black feelings among some white laborers.
Right. Instead of focusing anger on the system of slavery that might be undercutting them, some transferred that hostility onto the enslaved people themselves.
And the promise of Western land helped enable that.
It seems so. The source mentions George Henry Evans, who initially leaned abolitionist but later proposed segregated lands for Black Americans out west. His journal even asks, well, if we got rid of the Indians by moving them west, why not the Negro?
Wow, that really links westward expansion, racial exclusion, and violence directly.
It's stark.
Okay, let's shift from the metaphor to the actual violence. Sources are really clear. Violence wasn't incidental, it was integral. What do the early colonial records show?
The language is just brutal. Native Americans having to get out of the way, whether it was disease, outright murder, enslavement.
And Puritan writers framed it as God's will.
Yeah, God removing the heathen. They talked about fears of racial conflicts with pitiless agents of Satan. And then you have bizarre specifics, like William Clybourne getting a patent for a device to restrain Indians and make them work. And apparently he tested it on someone.
Even Benjamin Franklin, in a more secular way, talked about scouring our planet by clearing America of woods, justifying preference for his own complexion.
It wasn't just official policy driving this either. It was this loose network of rangers, militias, and crucially powerful land speculators.
Like Washington, Jefferson, Patrick Henry, ignoring restrictions like the 1763 Proclamation line.
Washington even told his survey to pretend he was hunting to avoid the authorities while grabbing land that was supposedly off limits. Speculation and bending rules were baked in early.
An outsider saw this happening.
Oh, yeah. The Spanish governor, Carondelet, described the U.S. settlers as uncontainable, just multiplying, resisting authority, moving on when they felt like it.
So the new nation, founded on this idea of freedom as movement, just inherits this settler lust for the land.
And the source says it led to ever more vicious variations, where hostility towards the British Crown just got transferred to the U.S. federal government whenever it tried to, say, protect native sovereignty.
Enter Andrew Jackson. The sources describe him as more brutal than those before him.
Yeah, consciously using violence against Native Americans to advance his political career. And even figures like Madison, Monroe, Jefferson, who had reservations about him, kind of depended on him.
To do what?
Remove the British, get Florida from Spain, and basically clear the continent of obstacles, Native Americans, African Americans, Mexicans, to fulfill Jefferson's vision of a continent scoured white. Jackson even boasted about vengeance being glutted after one massacre.
That constant violence eventually created fear of backlash, didn't it? Race terror, the source calls it.
By the late 1830s, yeah, there was this dawning realization, discussed openly, that the violence hadn't just provoked enemies, it had produced them.
And they started calculating the potential threat.
Yeah, estimates of thousands of potential warriors who, if united, could desolate large parts of the country or push the white population back. It's a grim acknowledgement of consequences.
Then comes the Mexican-American War in 1846. The source calls it costly, vexing, full of atrocities.
Driven by bitter racism and anti-Catholicism. Even Ulysses S. Grant, who fought in it, later called it one of the most unjust ever waged.
A training ground for the Civil War, too.
For many leaders, yes.
And the portrayal of Mexicans in the press was key to justifying it.
Absolutely. Dehumanizing language, degenerate, servile, imbecile because of mixed race, destined to melt away before Anglo-Saxon energy. It created a psychic border, making conquest seem natural, even necessary.
Politicians echoed this.
Oh, yeah. Senator Hannigan calling Mexicans unhomogeneous races unfit for liberty. It all fed into this Jacksonian consensus.
which defined freedom primarily as freedom from restraint.
Freedom to enslave, to dispossess, to move west, and morality itself got tied to that outward movement.
Like Octavio Paz observed, evil was located outside Indians, nature, obstacles to be destroyed.
Externalizing the problems,
Yeah.
just as King later criticized.
So the Civil War breaks that political coalition, but the myths survive. How did they reappear in the fight over Reconstruction, specifically the Freedmen's Bureau?
Well, the opposition to the Bureau basically just dusted off old Jacksonian arguments. Minimal government, racializing welfare, property rights, uber eyes, individualism, freedom from federal interference.
President Johnson himself framed it as a giveaway.
Totally. Said he wanted emancipation of the white man too, claiming the Bureau just created idleness with rations and put black people under new taskmasters. It's that classic Jacksonian framing of white men fighting federal enslavement.
But the head of the Bureau, Oliver Otis Howard, he had a different vision of freedom.
A fundamentally different one. He saw freedom for the formerly enslaved as requiring active, concerted government force to protect them, to ensure genuine individual independence against efforts to reimpose control. A social understanding of freedom, not just negative liberty.
The source also mentions this germ theory idea. What was that about?
It was this theory that American institutions traced back to ancient Saxon villages in Europe, like a seed or germ spreading freedom to the New World. It presented American history as this sort of natural upward progression.
Kind of sanitized the history.
You could say that. It often conveniently overlooked the violence and contradictions involved in that supposed spread of freedom.
Which brings us to Frederick Jackson Turner's famous 1893 essay. Probably the most influential articulation of the frontier thesis. What was his main point?
Turner argued the open West, the frontier experience, was what created American democracy and equality. This sense that the frontier was unending fostered unique American traits.
Like independence, individualism, fairness.
Initiative, honesty, trust, cooperation, all these positive traits.
Mm.
And importantly, he also saw it as a check on class conflict, on demands for wealth redistribution back east, another kind of safety valve.
But the sources point out Turner really downplayed the violence. Indian wars were just mentioned in passing.
Right, whereas someone like Theodore Roosevelt in The Winning of the West was much more explicit. He openly celebrated frontier vigilantism, rough justice.
Even admitted torture.
Yeah, argued it was sometimes healthy for the community, a necessary stage before formal law. He saw vigilantes suppressing people of color and flat out believed the person who puts the soil to use has the right to dispossess those who don't.
A brutal justification.
Very much so. Might makes right, essentially, justified by utility.
And this myth kept justifying state violence later on, like Woodrow Wilson during World War I.
Absolutely. Wilson used federal power for a massive crackdown on unions and leftists. And Turner, interestingly, endorsed it as a necessary temporary sacrifice of individual freedom.
The source calls it a time of unparalleled censorship, mass imprisonment, and anti-immigrant terror. Mentions the Elaine massacre in Arkansas.
It shows how that expansionist mindset, that idea of dealing with threats through force, could turn inward to suppress dissent at home, especially during wartime.
Let's talk about overseas expansion. The War of 1898, the Spanish-American War, seems like a key moment where the frontier idea explicitly went global.
Definitely. You had Southern veterans framing the invasion of Cuba as extending American goodness, a chance to show Southern valor, even a way to heal the wounds of the Civil War.
Reuniting North and South, boys who wore the blue and the boys who wore the gray.
That was the rhetoric. Confederate flags reportedly flew alongside U.S. and Cuban flags at some veteran gatherings, a symbolic reunion through imperial expansion.
But underneath that reconciliation narrative, the racism was still potent.
Oh, intensely so. Once Spain was defeated, the focus immediately shifted to the race of the people being liberated. Soldiers' letters in newspapers casually described shooting, lynching, torturing niggers in Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines.
And outrage over black U.S. soldiers guarding white Spanish prisoners.
Yeah, it starkly reveals the contradiction. Fighting for freedom abroad while simultaneously imposing the very same racial hierarchy and violence that defined the domestic frontier experience.
Fast forward again to after World War II, the word frontier seems to get a makeover.
It does. It kind of shakes off some of the negative baggage, becomes this more positive, generalized symbol of challenge, opportunity, progress. The U.S. had huge economic power, renewed confidence.
And the idea spread beyond geography.
Massively. Into nearly every academic field. FDR's new frontiers of the mind. science as the endless frontier. It became much more abstract, linked to innovation and potential, often detached in popular understanding from its violent origins.
But the source makes a crucial distinction here between the U.S. and other post-war nations regarding social rights.
Yes, while many countries were building welfare states and enshrining social rights, right to work, housing, healthcare, those kinds of rights never gained a strong legal foothold in the U.S.
The example given is Puerto Rico's 1952 Constitution.
Exactly. It included rights to work, social protection, but key figures in the U.S. Congress, Republicans, and Southern Democrats shot that down.
Why? What was the objection?
They feared it would bind the U.S. government to specific outcomes. They called them social and economic aims, not legal rights, and explicitly labeled them dangerous. The fear was they'd make citizens wards of the government.
That sounds like that old Jacksonian fear of government dependence again.
It resonates strongly with it, doesn't it? That emphasis on individual freedom from government tied to the frontier spirit.
And policymakers were also still deeply worried about the economy slipping back into depression.
Haunted by it. Dean Acheson argued forcefully that the U.S. had to open up foreign markets to absorb American production and prevent chaos at home. The global economy became the new frontier needed to sustain the American system.
Even if it meant avoiding domestic reforms.
Yes, he framed it as necessary to avoid changes that would completely change our Constitution, our relations to property, human liberty, our very conceptions of law. Global expansion was presented as preserving American freedom at home.
But this U.S.-led global system, despite the universalist rhetoric, wasn't exactly equal, was it?
No. The source points out the U.S. consumed a vastly disproportionate share of global resources, and that this imbalance was often maintained, sometimes violently, through interventions and coups abroad. The promise of universal benefit relied heavily on that assumption of endless growth, which benefited the U.S. most.
Okay, so that brings us closer to the present. With the geographical frontier long gone, the sources argue the focus increasingly shifts inward to the U.S.-Mexico border, the shadow side of frontier universalism.
It feels like the end point of that outward impulse. Reagan tried to revive the frontier spirit, but also started explicitly linking threats communists to the physical border.
And NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, is presented as a pivotal moment here.
Yeah, a really key turning point. It was sold, interestingly, using that old frontier language, the moral equivalent of the frontier, extending peace and prosperity.
A way to dilute extremists, give meaning to the republic.
The New Republic called it a moral mission, combining moral vision and national self-interest. Kissinger apparently saw it as a way to push back against leftist movements in Latin America, frontier thinking applied to trade policy.
But the argument in the source is that NAFTA didn't transcend the border, it actually hardened it, made it a permanent political battleground.
Exactly. And Clinton's promotion of it gets linked to domestic racial politics. Remember the anxieties about crime and race in the 90s?
Yeah, the super predator rhetoric.
Right. The New Democrats, like Clinton, started using cultural explanations for poverty and inequality, focusing on perceived pathologies, especially among young black men.
And Clinton, like in his Memphis speech, argued that economic expansion via NAFTA, not targeted social programs, was the solution to things like ghetto pathology.
Yes, and this framing, the source suggests, gave some Republicans a reason to back NAFTA. They saw globalization, perhaps cynically, as a tool to discipline the black underclass through market forces.
Wow. Meanwhile, NAFTA itself was having massive effects in Mexico.
Huge effects. Constitutional changes ending land reform, allowing privatization of communal ejido farms. This led to widespread displacement of peasants, land consolidation for exports, or farmers just being wiped out by cheaper U.S. imports.
And back in the U.S. during the Clinton years, the border itself physically hardened.
Dramatically.
Yeah.
Border Patrol tripled. Detention centers expanded. Deportation soared. Public opinion was swayed by focusing on migrants not assimilating or linking them to crime. Proposals to deny citizenship, schooling, healthcare.
And the source mentions investigations revealing serious abuse by Border Patrol.
Systemic abuse. Strippy detainees, cold rooms, handcuffing abuses, even reports of pushing people off cliffs. Just brutal realities on the ground.
Then you get the rise of vigilante groups like the Minutemen.
Yeah, taking the hunt for migrants nationwide, far from the actual border. They often merged with other right-wing groups like the Tea Party, engaging in armed standoffs. The source argues this contributed to rising anti-Latino violence and that performative cruelty became a way to show contempt for an establishment seen as too soft.
So the argument culminates here. The frontier is closed, the safety valve is shut, and the country is living past the end of its myth.
That's the core thesis. Expansion didn't deliver lasting peace or a progressive society. Instead, the source argues it left a legacy of endless war and a conspiratorial nihilism.
And the border wall becomes the new symbol, maybe more honest, acknowledging limits, scarcity, winners and losers.
It's tempting to see it that way, but the source suggests it's also an illusion. It recognizes limits by building a wall, but simultaneously refuses limits in other ways.
How so? Like Trumpism.
Yeah, fueling resentment, can't take care of others if we can't take care of ourselves, while also encouraging this defiant rejection of limits, like rolling coal or pulling out of climate agreements.
Making cruelty a brazen show of American freedom.
Exactly. The wall, built or not, symbolizes a nation still defining freedom as freedom from restraint, but maybe no longer pretending everyone gets to be free. It enforces that reality through domination and racism.
And this isn't entirely new either. The source notes Garrett Hardin calling for a wall based on race realism back in '77 and Pat Buchanan popularizing it.
And that lineage connects to current nativist arguments blaming Reagan's 1986 amnesty for Democratic gains, which then fuels unsupported claims of illegal voting to justify voter suppression. It all ties together.
Okay, one last piece. The source touches on that old question. Why no strong socialist movement or widespread support for social rights in the U.S.? The frontier as a deflection of class conflict is one answer.
Common one, yeah.
But there's this really fascinating, different take from Leon Samson in 1933.
It's quite provocative. Sampson argued Americans aren't anti-socialist. In a way, they think they already are socialists, but through frontier-forged Americanism.
What on earth does that mean?
His idea was that the socialist promise, like unalienated labor, wasn't something Americans felt they needed the state for. The American individual, shaped by the frontier, already saw himself as fully free, self-reliant, the final individual, and the socialist idea of the state withering away. Sampson thought Americans performed that daily through sheer informality, shaking hands with politicians, calling them by first names, like they were abolishing the state just through personal interaction.
So American individualism, rooted in the frontier, was seen as already delivering what socialism only promised.
That was Sampson's argument, that for every core socialist concept, there was already a kind of counter-concept embedded in American frontier individualism. It provides a really different angle on why those social rights were rejected after WWII as making citizens wards of the government. It wasn't just anti-statism. It might have been a belief that American individualism was the ultimate form of freedom already achieved.
Right. That's a lot to take in. So let's try to sum up. We've traced this frontier myth from its roots as an explanation for American power and a guide for policy.
To becoming this adaptable metaphor for endless growth, applied everywhere from westward expansion to global markets, technology, science.
But we've also really dug into the dark side. The inherent violence against Native Americans, against Mexicans, the cynical use of the safety valve idea to manage social conflict, particularly around slavery.
And the connection between expansion abroad and suppressing dissent or racial justice movements at home, plus the constant threat of racism justifying dominance and exclusion all along the way.
We saw how the myth survived huge challenges like the Civil War, adapting into new forms like the germ theory or Turner's thesis, even as critics like Martin Luther King forcefully pointed out its damaging pathologies.
And finally, how, with the physical frontier gone, the border became the new focus, not representing universal freedom anymore, but hardened by policies like NAFTA, symbolized by the wall, and marking a shift towards enforcing limits through cruelty and exclusion.
It really paints a picture, doesn't it? How this one central idea profoundly shaped not just land, but identity, race, economics, foreign policy, often by providing a way to avoid facing difficult internal truths.
Suggesting that maybe the problems America tried to push outward for centuries are now kind of bouncing back, concentrated right there at the border, impossible to ignore.
Okay, thinking about all this, here's a final thought for you, our listener, to consider. If that frontier myth really did function as a way for America to avoid reckoning with its internal problems by always looking outward, always expanding, what happens now? Now that the frontier is closed, the safety valve is shut, and that outward projection seems impossible. How does a nation finally confront the issues it has spent centuries running from?